Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, whoever is joining today for this watch this very important panel discussion today. Today, we brought a very important topic for every one of us to discuss and learn from our expert panel. And today, we have joined with a very strong panel, industry thought leaders from US and Qatar. And before we start our discussion, I would like kindly request to introduce yourselves. Let's start from Rebecca.
Thanks, Ahmad. Thanks for having me today. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are in the world. My name is Rebecca Evans. I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager at OneTrust. We are the leading provider of privacy management solutions. Have been at OneTrust for about 3 years, supporting our privacy, data governance, and most recently our AI governance solutions, working with early adopters, understanding their program requirements, and ensuring that our roadmap aligns to their strategies. So really excited here to share some of those perspectives and how some of the leading companies across the globe are thinking about and developing programs for governance of AI systems.
Pleasure having you, Rebecca, on the panel. And our next panelist, which do not require an introduction around in the region though, but I'll kindly request Imran to introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Ahmad Bhai, and welcome, Rebecca. It's my pleasure to be actually in this session. A bit background. So I work with AlJazeera Media Network. I think everyone in the world now knows about this network. My responsibility is primarily I'm responsible for the data GRC in the organization and the global data protection officer for the AlJazeera. Also, additionally, I'm also finishing my law degree, completing my Juris Doctorate. That is going to be done in the next few months. Hopefully.
Glad to have you, Imran, on the panel. So, without any further ado, we'll start to discuss today's topic, which is navigating the ethical compass of AI, a deep dive into the AI governance. As we join today to discuss the ethical compass of AI here, we happen to find ourselves at a pivotal moment in the human history. The rapid advancement of AI presents immense opportunities, from revolutionizing healthcare to addressing the climate change. However, it also poses significant challenges, as we know, including potential biases, job displacements or replacements, and privacy concerns, of course. To harness the full potential of AI while mitigating its risk, we must establish strong ethical guidelines and robust governance frameworks. And this is what we're going to discuss today during our discussion. So without any further ado, I'll start the discussion by posting my first question: that how do we define AI ethics, and why is it crucial to establish clear ethical guidelines for AI development and deployment? Floor is open. Anyone would like to start?
So if I may actually take that on, I think one of the primary things before we go into the AI ethics, let's define what is actually AI and artificial intelligence. One of the things is that any intelligence basically has three parameters. It has information. It has it can actually process information. It can communicate out of that information, and it has the logics to come to that output. So whatever it is going to communicate, it has certain logics built into it. So we call it artificial intelligence because it's actually done artificially by some technology systems. And that is basically where the intelligence comes in. So question comes down to is how do we even define ethics forget about artificial, forget about AI, how do you define ethics? And if you really ask that question, you will find that each of us will have a different definition of what really ethics is. And then comes to the question about how do we develop ethics in the mankind, right? So we choose to teach our children certain values, certain things, and through a educational system, and the societal system, we try to develop certain ethics into it. Now, the similar things in the AI, in the artificial way, is actually the same thing, that we have to figure out what is that really we want in ethically in our society. So if it's a challenge, the reason is that even without the artificiality, I don't think we'll have an agreement what really is ethical. There are certain parameters, certain things that universally we accept as ethical. And now it comes down to is how do we really translate that into an artificial mechanism? And I think that's where it comes down to is when we are teaching our children, for example, certain things, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable for us to really teach them. Should we be teaching them about how to use a gun in a primary school, or should I be actually teaching them something beyond that, some standards? So it comes down to the same way. What do you really put into developing our children as you are raising their learning standards? Do you teach them topics of a PhD level at the elementary school, or do you actually do a gradual progression of their learning? And I think this is the same way that we really have to think about when you are thinking about developing the ethical standards into our development and deployment of the AI. It depends on where we are, what we are really looking for. I just want to bring from that perspective a bit. Maybe Rebecca has more to say.
Yeah, I'll chime in. And I'm so glad that you started with defining what AI is, because I think that's table stakes and foundational for building ethics into kind of the development and use of AI systems. I can't tell you how many times I speak to new customers at OneTrust who are starting this journey. And this is the first problem that they raise, is that the different people that are involved in terms of governance of AI systems can't seem to align on what a common definition is. So, and then when you look to some of the laws and standards like NIST and ISO and OECD, there are also some variants along the way in terms of how they are defining those systems. So EU AI Act has standardized around the OECD, and that's how we have standardized it within our products that we support at OneTrust. Ultimately, it's a function of inputs, as you mentioned, outputs, and how these systems are impacting their environment. And when it comes to the application of AI ethics and standards, there are principles that are kind of enshrined across OECD, EU AI Act, ISO, NIST around transparency, privacy, security, all things that are well and good and probably enshrined in previous frameworks. And then additional considerations around fairness and inclusivity and human rights, and of course the environmental sustainability. Or think about just the amount of compute and water that is required to power some of these large language models. There are going to be massive challenges that we as a global society have to address in order to facilitate the mass adoption of the technology. What I think is so critical, though, is the educational component and making sure that you bring the right stakeholders along for the journey as you are embarking on an AI strategy. Ultimately, you will need to set a large table. It is a committee-based approach. You need diverse perspectives, from representing people who will be building and using the systems to those who will be impacted. So it's really important to set a big table, make sure there's clarity on what the intent of the AI application is, and that there is clarity around how it is being used, which poses a total challenge today because a lot of these systems are considered to be black box models. So it's an interesting time to be in this space, but ultimately I think it's really what I'm optimistic about is just how many folks across the business from different walks of life are really leaning into advancing governance structures within their organization.
Yeah, rightly said. Yeah, because when you said that there has to be a clarity, and what Imran highlighted about this, the education perspective of it. And when we talk about the different stakeholders to come and join their minds and brains to come up with a common agreeable model of ethics, because as Imran rightfully said, every ethical system is linked with some value system. So for one perspective it is right, and for the others it is wrong. I mean, which value system we have to link it with when we're talking about a global perspective. So that's where, I mean, I would request, like, if you can share your views, both of you, is like, when we talk about AI specific systems, which in my definition, it's a software which writes itself, simply. So when we talk about the algorithmic stuff in the MLOps and all that, I mean, we talk about this algorithmic biases, which basically differs the opinions from a different perspective. How do you take about this question?
So you have to. So I think before you, in one of the challenges is basically knowing what you really want the system to do. So we talked about a system, right? So when you develop any system, you should have a clear idea what that system you intend the system to do. The second is basically coming down to, okay, for me to come to that decision, what is the input do I really need for the system to really consider? Now the challenge is sometimes is not knowing what we want to do, that system to do. And that the second challenge is, depending on the model or algorithm that we use, you might not know what is actually happening in the middle. That's like a black box. It's very much similar with, say, sometimes is that, say for example, if I throw a ball at you, right? Your body can possibly react one of the multiple ways, right? So you expect that maybe your hand will go over there, catch the ball, or you might move your head and duck the ball. Now, all of them are valid output that you are looking for, right? So you need to know what is that you are actually looking for and what is the right behavior. Just like but you really sometimes don't know how inside our brain, how really that calculation, that measurement, that algorithm that our brain used, how did it come to that conclusion is not always very clear. And I think that's one of the challenges that we are seeing as the AI is becoming more advanced, is that the input may be understood, the output is being observed, but the logic has not, or is becoming more complex. And I think that's one of the biggest challenge. Most of the AI those who are actually the scientists, AI scientists, I don't want to call the developers AI scientists. That would be I think a misrepresentation. But much of the AI scientific communities are not always being able to explain the logic behind it, especially as it is learning in that. The second part is that input that we provided. If we look into ourselves, if it is not properly mature and proper ethical boundary is not set, you might give a child, let's give a thing, a child, right, a gun. And I want to use that as an example sometimes, is that you see that a child doesn't know the harm that gun can do and can just take that and shoot someone. Now, the child cannot be held responsible for giving the gun without the parameter, without that education, without knowing that ethical boundary about what to do with it. The similar way, when we are giving information to a system, we need to basically make sure the system is ready to be able to behave in a responsible, ethical way. And that is the guideline, that is the education, that's the training, that's what you need to ensure that whether that system is actually doing in that way or not. And understanding that from the input that you have to the output, what are the potential pitfalls that can happen, as you rightly mentioned, certain biasness and certain algorithmic bias could be systematic bias that is actually built in the development of it. Are we really appropriately taking that into consideration? And it comes down to who is looking at it. So if you, and as I mentioned, that each of us, three of us over here, if I ask sometime on a particular area, we may actually differ our opinion about what is the right thing to do in these things. And this is where regulators cannot always say what is ethical, right? Each of us are going to be. but it's about our attempt and our journey to make sure that we are going into a more ethical ways of doing it. Now, the previous challenge or previous issue was that when an individual is making a decision, it's mostly an individual. The effect of us as a human being on an individual level, depend on what level of the society we are performing, may be limited. But in the areas of AI, that impact can be very much unlimited in some way, because we really don't know how that is actually happening. So in this area, I was actually talking to my wife yesterday. I'm like, when the Google came in, one of the things happened is the knowledge of obscure knowledge became more obscure because Google started to promote what is popular. And we only started to search and only look for the first top 5 hit, and maybe looking through 5 documents and as such. What comes in the 100th area, we don't look at it, right? And that's how we human beings reacted through that. So means the knowledge that was not popular became a lot more obscure. And with AI, it's actually changing in much different way. Now we are taking everything in the society in a way, especially with the Gen AI, is that we don't have understanding about how we even coming to that conclusion. We are just taking that and using it. So this is where I think the ethical side of it is not fully understood, that input and what the output that I'm looking for, and whether it is the right thing, is the challenge that I would see in the way of establishing. And a clear one is definitely is hard to really judge what is a clear ethical guideline. Each of us will be different, but there has to be some level of understanding at a national and international level about what is acceptable and what is not. And that's what we see with the EU AI Act, unacceptable areas. We see in the US presidential ordinance, we are also seeing that. So we see the regulators are scrambling about it, but there is a significant absence in that area right now.
Yeah, very insightful. Very insightful. So, Rebecca, your views? Yep.
I was going to echo Imran's sentiments around of course, we see the start of in any sort of project. We can hold the model as a black box and still do a world of good when we can understand what those inputs are, what data variables and environments are going to be going into the system, and the outcomes, and really grounding the organization and the stakeholders in what those outcomes are and challenging them. I've seen several projects across customers and people who are starting these programs, and you would be surprised how many have some sort of, they have some sort of intake process where anybody within the business can submit an idea. And the challenge is really pushing those stakeholders to take a step back and think about what the outcome is. It's not just about, we're going to drive efficiency, we're going to make it easier to work. Like, those are really nice outcomes, but they're just not tangible. I think when you challenge a team that is looking to adopt a system to really think about concrete outcomes that are measurable, that's where you start to see more of an understanding. Even just holding that black box in the middle is an unknown. Now, there are certainly stakeholders within the business who do understand how these systems are coded and developed. A computer only does what you tell it to do, right? And so this is a challenge for that specialized talent to, everybody has to adapt. We as non-technical stakeholders have to have a moral imperative to understand how this technology is used, right? And similarly, those specialists who are building and coding have a moral imperative to lean in and communicate and upskill how they're driving awareness of the decisions that are being made. We're going to need incredible amounts of documentation on inputs, on the pros and cons and the decisions of what we're going to weight at a higher, weight higher in inputs, and what we're going to maybe apply a lower weight to in a decision of an outcome. And again, I think to Imran's point, this isn't black and white. This is quite subjective, and that's why I talked about setting a big table. It is so important that you have different perspectives in that planning committee, bringing diverse viewpoints to the table. It's not always going to be easy. Of course, you're adding more friction, you're adding more requirements to the beginning of a process. But in time, the companies that build this into their DNA do start to see a more streamlined approach, do start to see kind of the economies of scale as they start to get a few projects under their belt. And ultimately what this means is we're talking about business continuity here. No one wants to build a system that is mission critical for their business that ultimately is deemed too risky to go to market, or the FTC orders algorithmic disgorgement, or the data that they put into the system is actually data they didn't have entitlements to use, and they have to go back and retrain the system, which is an incredibly time-consuming and expensive endeavor. So it's really important to get these things right up front.
So if I may actually,
only one point. Yeah. That meant, as you both of you rightfully said, that meant assessing that what is the outcome of that training model which we are using down the line, and defining the parameterized the inputs, and of course the training our model is very important from as far as system is concerned. But when I'm just adding one additional part of the same question, is that, as you said, there's a different stakeholders. Nobody wants to create the system, though, which is in our hand. What if we want to, we can do all that just to minimize the hallucinations, ensuring the accuracy of the data and all that. But what if the stakeholders' intent is not right? If they how to ensure that they operate in the ethical boundaries? Over to you, Imran.
So I'll look at this. Actually, I think I'll answer the last question that you asked in a bit. But let's look at this way. If you know your input, and if it is all the inputs are known, and you have a logical process that you want it to follow based on those input to a particular output, then AI can just make it very fast, make it more efficient in coming to that conclusion. So if you, for example, you have 20 different input that you want to take it on, and you want to come to certain probability and factors to calculate in that. We can look at how human has made those decisions, and that's exactly what Rebecca was handling. That algorithm can very much predictably say this is likely the output, that outcome can happen. Now, if we develop a system that is basically we intend to destroy a city, doesn't matter whether it's algorithmically doing it or a human is pressing the button to do it, it can be done. I mean, it comes down to, again, what is the output that you are actually looking for. The challenge is not about when the human can explain and knows what is that output is going to be. The challenge is when you don't know what the outcome is going to be, and whether that outcome is a right outcome or not is where the challenge comes in. And so if you don't know the input that is going to be used, and if you didn't really set any parameters about that decision making, and it's making the decision, you're giving it that, giving the system the autonomy to make that decision, that's where the challenge comes down to. And the regulator is trying to basically put certain obligation on the organizations to say, hey, and like if you look at the EU AI Act, saying, look at it, look at your data, training data, make sure that your training data is not biased, making sure that your training data correctly represents the environment or the expected demographics that you are going to be looking at. So asking for that. It also says, look at your algorithm itself, look at your model. Is it really, is there a built-in bias into it? Is there is there something that might be, taken wrong? Like, for example, if you say, go and, throw the bomb at some place, right? Automatically and do that. And then also saying there should be human oversight, and human oversight can be on the individual decisions. If it is if the decision is being made on an individual level, or but if it is also in a broader level, like it needs to be made a lot of decisions, then making a mechanisms to have that human oversight built into your things. Just like, for example, if you build a chocolate factory, you have a quality management. I'm going from gun to chocolate now. So if you go into a chocolate factory, there is a quality management, right? You don't test every chocolate, but you test sufficient enough to provide a confidence that your chocolate is coming out the way that you want. And that's exactly how the regulators are looking at it, saying, hey, you guys need to make sure that you have a system in place. You know about the ingredient that you are going to put in, that the machine is going to give you the chocolate. You may not know if, because now all you are doing is basically in between how the chocolates are made, you are not fully sure because you have used some complex algorithm that you cannot explain, but then you have to do more testing to make sure that they're not going to kill someone in the process. So it comes down to what you're achieving attempt to achieve, and making sure that the output that's coming in on either individual level or in a collective on a regular basis, you have a particular number that you want to test it out. Just like if you are making chocolates, you don't sampling size and as such, you figure it out what is best for your organization for that particular areas based on the impact. So if the impact is going to be that people are rights going to be violated or people's lives going to be in danger, then make sure that you have a lot more check boxes about those things. And I think this is where we need to, we are going to go in that direction. Question is, how do we do it? And is the organization, one is, I think Rebecca was mentioning, is that people are not fully even aware what the system is supposed to be. What is AI is, first of all. The second is all this discussion, I think many are not thinking from that perspective, right? And that's the challenge. That's an education that, again, if you look at the UAI Act, literacy is built into as one of the article of the law, is that you have to make sure that every level within the development cycle, within the organization and user community, there is an awareness that you are actually doing it. And I think this is a right session for us to even develop that. Over to you, Rebecca.
I'll add 3 comments on training and codes of conduct and attestations to that point. I can sit here and be an armchair expert on international cooperation, but that's not my domain of expertise. But what I see is how organizations are thinking about this and trying to uphold those standards within the metaphorical 4 walls of their organization. There's no such thing as 4 walls anymore, given how interconnected we all are. But on training, I think it's one, I see organizations investing heavily in their workforce, upskilling, education around basic principles of AI systems and ethical use. I think where we're going to see organizations extend is more specific system-based training for the individuals who will be using or developing particular systems. There's a need to go a layer deeper. It's not just a broad universal training. There will be more specialized training paths for those stakeholders who are involved in the system. We see codes of conduct. So individuals within an organization have to actually sign as part of their employment agreement that they are going to uphold the principles and standards that are enshrined in their organization's code of conduct. And then number 3, I think we're going to see, attestations become more of a part along the process, attesting along the design, development, and deployment of an AI system that you have adequately put in the right the right combination of ingredients into the chocolate bar, that you have tested the chocolate bar during the evaluation process, that it meets an acceptable standards. And I think that there's going to be a lot more weight in that employment contract and holding individuals accountable for their part in the chain of events to bringing an AI system through to deployment.
Yeah, very insightful inputs, and that's why we're developing the AI specific systems, testing the models, and ensuring what data we are training the model with needs to be ensured that it's accurate, and which basically brings out the expected outcome. So, Rebecca, I'll ask this question to you. What are the best practices to ensure that we minimize the hallucinations, and we minimize in terms of number of iterations of testing that data or training our models?
Yeah, so I want to just be really laser focused on the question. When you're talking about hallucinations, are you thinking about the hallucinations in the context of a large language model and a generative AI system? Okay, because
exactly.
we started the conversation, and AI is really broad, and it's not just large language models and Gen AI, although all the conversations these days are very clustered around there. There's plenty of techniques that can be used to mitigate the risk of hallucinations. First is grounding. You have a human in the loop that's going to verify and explain to a model, no, that's not correct. Yes, that is correct. And ultimately, the model learns over time that what is an acceptable answer and what is not acceptable. You can also write really explicit instructions in the design phase for a system to not make any guesses. So that's what we did at OneTrust. We recently launched a chat bot that is informed by our data guidance research, the world's largest repository of regulatory research. And in the instruction manual for the system, we do not allow it to make up answers, or every answer has to be cited to something that is within our body of knowledge within data guidance. And in that way, we are not, giving forth fake. It's not making up fake lawsuits to defend a position. It is really rooted in what is available to it. So I see a lot of promise today in RAG environments, retrieval augmented generation, where you're appending a body of knowledge and research to an input when you make that query. So rather than training and doing all of the exposure in the training, that's sort of part of the prompt engineering process. So grounding with a human in the loop, using something like a RAG environment, exposing more information. I also think that there's a massive onus on data enrichment, especially as we start to look at the organization's data footprint. 90% of an organization's data footprint is unstructured data. So that's data that we need to make sense of. We need to enrich it. So there's a lot of classification practices, a lot of tagging that we need to do up front to understand and make sense of what is in those resources that we're going to expose to a system. The nice thing about generative AI is that it sort of cuts some of the time down, taking that unstructured data and putting it to use, right? We don't need to have a human to go through every single thing and make sense of it. This is a really great use case and application for generative AI. But we need to make sure that we have the right enrichment, the right tagging and classification so that we're pulling the right resources. And then, of course, upholding standards. I work in a privacy company, making sure that we're upholding our obligations on the privacy and security side, redacting information, making sure that only the right inputs are going forward. So a lot of different considerations in terms of mitigating that hallucination. And sometimes it's going to come into conflict with some more traditional practices like data minimization. So there's going to have to be a conversation in the organization of what risk we're willing to accept in order to drive better quality output for the system.
So I think Rebecca really on the hallucination a significant issue, and the methods that Rebecca actually highlighted. So mostly a generative AI is generating new content without just providing an output. So in the way of development is knowing how you are really limiting it, whether you are limiting to a set of data that actually you have provided. So in the case of data guidance, for example, that response needs to be developed based on the material that is made available. But in that particular areas also, is it really being able to correlate effectively? And this is where the training of the system really needs to come in. And I think that's one of the challenges that I see when organizations are adopting generative AI. They think that, okay, I can give my content and I can have use the OpenAI's algorithm and the LLM to then just do the work. And without doing that checking and without training and making sure that those responses that's coming in and validating if they're really providing that accurately and retraining it to make sure that actually the LLM has adopted those changes. So it's like when you are training your children and you give him 10 books to read through, and he comes to say, okay, this is the conclusion. You said, no, this is not the conclusion. This is how you need to really think. And that learning is really we think that doesn't need to really happen. And that's where the problem lies, is that organization really needs to make sure that training the algorithm is something of an investment they have to make. Now, if we don't use the generative AI, if you just want to use the traditional AI, the learning may be more limited. It's more about false positive, false negative, and as such, and you might be able to kind of even predict and or create a system to even monitor that. But when it comes to generative AI, it's not necessarily the same way. But that's why we have to really have the concerns, is that is the organization really thinking through the whole thing, is really planning accordingly the whole thing. And hallucination will only come in, or I shouldn't say only come in, but hallucination will come in when you are giving it an open-ended and you are not really asking in your prompting or in your development to limit in there. So just like a child will make up stuff because you want to give the answer. If you want to say that, give me just an answer, okay? The AI system is designed to just take whatever it is out there that it learned and try to make up something if that's what you're asking for.
Yeah, very rightfully said. So given in the context of what has been said, it's quite often has been heard, at least what I heard from within a lot of conferences, is that there's no AI without IA. IA stands for information architecture. So, Imran, from your standpoint, how critical it is to have a proper data governance framework within the organization before we get into the real hardcore stuff of the defining the AI legislation and reach to the level of ethical AI?
The challenge, and I'll give you this example, and that was a few years ago before this generative AI came about, is that, say, for example, if you are just sitting in a help desk and basically you say, okay, I'm going to measure your performance based on number of ticket you close every day. Think about the behavior that will be encouraging them, right? If you don't use any other parameter, just closing, it means that you are encouraging them to just close the ticket. They pick up the phone call, they close the ticket. Whether they come to the right resolution or not is not something that in your parameter you are not taking into account. So if you really don't know what information you need to make that decision, you are inherently going to have, unknown information that you will require to make that decision. So a technical system, because that's what we are talking about. AI is at the end, it's a system that needs to consider certain input, and that input could be limited or could be something that billions that we when it comes to OpenAI and as such, right? There are a billion different types of input that might be coming in, or limited if you are talking about the traditional AI. If you don't have proper understanding and architecture in your organization on the information side of it, then you might not be considering all the input that you will require to come to that decision. And that's one challenge. The second, I think what also Rebecca mentioned about classification and who should have access to the information. So if your organization has intellectual property or confidential information, and you put that, say, openly for the AI to take it on, then it might actually reveal the information that you don't mean to give it out. So this is an issue that creates a challenge. So if you don't have proper data governance, where you are basically having a proper data quality management or proper classification of those data, then you are going to face the challenge of your information leakage, that within the organization or outside the organization, because you did not really properly manage it. So a data governance is definitely a foundation for you to be able to use your data effectively, even in the traditional AI. I'm not talking about generative AI. Even in the traditional AI, you really need to have a proper data governance to rightly use it, because the danger of uh, using the wrong information, giving the wrong information, is that your conclusion, your output would most likely be wrong and biased, and which is a ethical problem to start off. Forget about law and rules and as such. So if I was going to fire someone because he's only handling 20 tickets a day, but that 20 tickets he actually did, all those 20 people are satisfied. Whereas someone who did 100 tickets a day, but the people who are calling who are not satisfied. If I'm just taking that in that kind of a model, then we are going to be harming the organization at the end, and harming the individual who we just let go because of decision that we made about not really thinking through and the information architecture or governance of the information within the organization.
I'll take it a step further. You cannot have AI governance without data governance. And I will fully own my bias. I work at a company that sells data privacy products and data governance products. So, that maybe I'm sipping the Kool-Aid here, but AI is a data hungry technology. It requires data to run. And, we've had data access, data sharing, data control problems for decades, right? As we've seen organizations over the last 5 years move these massive data migration projects to getting data to the cloud, they've really been readying the organization to harness data more effectively and more quickly. Gen AI has stretched the capabilities of the modern data infrastructure. You can't just narrowly focus on the AI governance challenge. That's because the AI that you're using, more often than not, is a model that you've procured from a third party. Very few players are actually building large language models. You are provisioning, you are licensing a third party. And so overnight, Gen AI has sort of ripped the Band-Aid on all of the not failures, I'll tone down the language a little bit, but all of the challenges and maybe investments that we were piling up that we didn't make on our data governance strategy. Overnight, those challenges are increasingly more pressing because an AI is now an amplifier of that loose governance, right? The Gen AI, you can't take the data back once you put it into a system. It's just like a brain. Once I tell you something, I can't take it away, right? These models don't forget. So you're sharing data. You want to make sure that you don't expose privacy or the sensitivity of that data to that third party. So that's one big challenge. And then, the other area where I see it as a data challenge really comes back to some of these ethical principles that we talked about, right? Accuracy requires really high data quality. You need to make sure that you have accurate data, that you have the appropriate tags, the appropriate time, the appropriate representation, not even thinking about, the human element, but you can have bias that is temporal. If you're running a model to push, in a retail context, and you're talking about a season like Christmas season coming up or holiday season coming up, but all of your data that you're used to train it is from the summer, then you're going to have data that is not accurate, not relevant to the outcomes in the environment where you're going to be using that. So you can have bias that presents itself in different ways. But to uphold those fairness, those fair and ethical principles, you need to have accurate data profiling. So all of this comes into conflict with data minimization practices, and this is one of the challenges that I see customers grappling with. Is they've spent so much time not collecting sensitive data and reducing the overall risk within their footprint. But how do they go and make sure that they have the right representation? You need to collect that information. You need to understand the race, gender, ethnicity for an individual to ensure that you have adequate representation and that your model is not skewing towards any one particular population, right? These things exist. Bias exists regardless if we don't collect the data, right? So in order to mitigate it, you do need to capture and understand it and use it in the appropriate ways, which is going to heighten the burden on our security controls, right? We're going to need to make sure we have really accurate, granular governance controls that we're masking based on different roles and use cases and purpose. And this goes back to kind of traditional data privacy challenges around making sure that you're using data in accordance with the purpose that you ultimately collected it for. If we're thinking about a situation where we relied on consent for the individual, which is going to pose a challenge, right? In order for consent to be lawful, it has to be freely given and can be freely taken away. So if an individual is going to consent to it, you have to think about the considerations downstream and using that data in an environment where it may be taken back and you don't have the ability to remove it from a system. So I don't see these as separate initiatives. Every facet of ethical principles comes back to a data challenge, in my opinion.
Exactly. That lays the very foundation of any AI program or AI governance program in the organization. Very rightfully said. So since we have talked a lot about the technology and the data aspect of it, now let's talk about the AI ethics landscape. I mean, what sort of like regulations, standards are available for professionals to comply with or to follow?
So I think, Rebecca, you mentioned a few of them. NIST, for example, ISO, for example, OECD, for example. There are standards that came out of it, depending on which areas you are looking at. So if you are looking at the risk management framework, I think this NIST have done a good job in my view. Maybe if Rebecca might highlight more areas. OECD in a way of a policy, as well as ethical side of it. I think OECD does, I think, a good job in the way of what they have came up with. There are different national bodies that has come up with many different framework and standards. On the regulatory side, I would say that EU-AI Act has been a comprehensive one. It is similar in many ways. This may actually act similar to the way that we saw in the privacy, the GDPR, as becoming like a golden standard on the privacy. We may see EU-AI Act coming in the similar way. But many regulators have taken, rather than coming into an individual regulation like EU-AI Act, we saw that many have taken the approach of principle-based approach, which was the executive order coming out of the US, as well as OECD and many others, kind of developed a principle-based approach where there's basically, just like GDPR has 7 principles that we can see, it's kind of developing those principles that organization or anyone need to really follow those principles, and they look at it from that perspective. But when you use a principle-based approach, then you need a stronger regulatory body that really have a mechanisms to validate if organization misuse the principle or not. I think that's something new that we are going to see in an ongoing basis, how it really plays out. It's a new technology, new challenges, and I think that the knowledge and skill sets are significantly lacking. I'm talking about in every profession, whether in the GRC profession, whether in the development community, whether in the regulatory community, the level and challenges are still not fully understood. And the technology itself is evolving rapidly. So I'm expecting a significant changes in the way that we are looking at it now to a year or two down the line.
Yeah,
Rebecca.
I'll also add, what took GDPR about 20 years only took the EU AI Act about 5. So that should say a lot in terms of the pace at which we're seeing the regulatory landscape evolve. Gartner predicts that 75% of the world's population is subject to global privacy laws as of this year. So that took 20 years, and here we are today. So just consider kind of the pace and the impact that we're going to see the AI regulations deliver. If the Brussels effect for GDPR was any sort of indicator, we're going to see very similar wave of impact with respect to the EU AI Act, which codifies a risk-based approach to AI systems. You have unacceptable use cases that are just flat out banned within the EU, except in certain government contexts. Then you have your high-risk use cases, which really is where I think the EU AI Act packs the most compliance burden. I hear people in the industry saying the requirements are an inch wide and a mile deep, and this is really where most of the requirements and obligations are going to lie. Then for your low risk use case, your medium risk and your low risk use cases, you're going to see codes of conduct becoming requirements, and then transparency obligations, making sure end users are aware that they are being impacted by an AI system in the decision tree. Ultimately, the EU AI Act also sets forth roles and obligations based on your relationship to an AI system. So if you're a deployer, so you're licensing an AI system. So this is the context of I am procuring OpenAI or Azure OpenAI, and I'm going to be using it internally, or I might be embedding it within a product, depending on the level of configuration and customization to it. You might actually graduate to that level of developer. But then there are also obligations on part of the developer to ensure that you are upholding the requirements as codified in the EU AI Act. You're delivering those conformity assessments, testing ultimately that you have upheld those requirements. So there's considerations across the entire supply chain, from the usage side as well as the development side. And as well, there are considerations from every sort of phase of the life cycle for an AI system. And that's just within the EU. So we've seen global laws and regulations. We've seen regulations in Singapore and China. I've seen really promising initiatives when it comes to government and private cooperation. In the EU, we see work being done around sandboxes and testing environments for entities to have that transparency and in cooperation with government. In Utah, there's some really interesting developments in the same vein. One of the interesting additions to that government-private sector cooperation in Utah is there needs to be proof that you have enough capital to be able to actually undergo this type of work in cooperation with the government. So, AI is incredibly expensive. I think McKinsey's done some really great work to do some calculations on the cost of AI systems. Something that is sort of a low customization, something off the shelf, is still going to run an organization around $1 million a year, between $1 and $5 million to run. So this comes back to those kind of use cases and the inputs and the outputs, making sure that you really are putting your capital towards a project and initiative that is going to deliver that ROI upfront is of critical importance.
Perfect. So, apart from the standards which Imran, you highlighted, and particularly the almighty GDPR and the European Union AI Act, it's been seen like when every country is coming up with their own sort of specific, more domestic kind of standards. So what needs to be done to foster the international cooperation on AI ethics? Like, for example, if someone asks me the question, what about, why not to start with ISO 42001? It's a global practice, and one more like NIST AI, risk management, these kind of global frameworks. What's your take on this?
See, the way that I look at it is that I think in the beginning you mentioned that AI is just a system, right? Now it comes down to the standards or regulation that it really needs to take into consideration what areas you really want to practice and whether there are ethical guidelines available in there. So if, for example, if I'm going to be using AI in the healthcare in that particular country, or in that particular country where that particular AI system is going to operate, are there ethical guidelines or are there practice in the healthcare itself, right? If you are talking about in the automotive industry, in the autonomous cars, similar things. Are there rules about driving in that particular country? So if you are driving in maybe Cairo, where there is no rule, means that red means go, you might have different challenges with the AI systems, in there. In the areas where there is a lot more internationalization of certain services, for example, maybe airlines, for example, where you need to have international cooperation to fly between the two different countries, right? So you will need to most likely create more of a common standards for them to follow. But in the other areas may not be so much. In the areas of defense, national security, and the national defense, you might actually see AI play completely different roles, because you will have a defensive AI and offensive AI. Just like you have, weapons that you create as a deterrent, from others to attack you, you might also create weapons to attack other countries. So it depends on where within the domestic areas where we feel the challenge, and in the international areas where we feel the challenge or not. And I do believe there is a significant, there is two part comes in here. That is, the countries need to feel a challenge that they are not being able to address alone. And that's when basically international rule comes in, because they are not being able to address that by themselves. There are other things that is at play. Now, if we look into the world global economy, there are few companies that controlling most of the technology. And I know I'm sounding a bit in a different ways. There are companies that controls the technology. That means that these are an individual government may not be able to put rules without burden, creating a burden, or without really not be able to manage it properly. So if, say, for example, when Italy is trying to say, okay, we don't want to have ChatGPT running in our country, it can create other issues. It can actually, there is a fear about leaving behind, being left behind. So all these things are playing a role in terms of how the adoption should take place, whether what are the challenges going to be. And if the international community feels that they're not being able to address themselves, they would come up with a more common, unified international standard, not an ISO international standard, but a mandated international standard through a treaty, like you have WTO agreement and other type of an agreement, where, or even in the copyright area, we have the TRIPS agreement and WIPO agreement. So you have an agreement which actually forms an international agreement on the international level where countries cooperate. And I do believe that in the areas of AI, it's a matter of time when the countries will start to realize that they actually cannot just depend on ISO and on individual, but there has to be some level of national, international level, country level collaboration for them to protect, I would say, civilization in the upcoming days.
So, Rebecca, your views on this, considering the time shortage, briefly, please.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I think the other area that Imran didn't touch on that I foresee will be a huge area of international cooperation will be just the massive evolution of our global infrastructure to be able to sustain this technology. I think compute will have to be reclassified as a public utility in order for there to be, and in order for this technology to be truly democratized. And we're seeing a lot of that kind of investment being, only the big tech players really have access to that. So we're going to have to see a lot of work in terms of cooperation at an international level to be able to ensure that we are distributing the right outcomes in an equitable and fair way in the global economy, and not kind of making some of the same mistakes of generations past in terms of where we're seeing kind of these empires being built in the new AI first world. So probably a pessimistic outlook to end our session with, but I was asked to keep it brief, so I tried to keep it punchy as well.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. And this is where we are at the end of our session, because we have completed our time slot. Thank you so very much, Rebecca, for joining us, and Imran, and for sharing your insightful contribution towards the community experiences and the knowledge which you have shared. And thank you for the audience who have joined us today, and looking forward to have you in the next coming sessions as well. Once again, thank you so much, and have a nice day ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.